The 48-21 Louisville football victory over the 10th ranked Wake Forest Demon Deacons was huge for many reasons, but perhaps no reason was bigger than the help that it gave to head coach Scott Satterfield in terms of job security. On today's episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast, we're going to break that down and more. So with that being said, let's get right on into the show.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what's going on, everyone? Welcome into another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Happy Halloween. I'm your host, Dalton Pence. I serve as a credentialed media member for Cardinal Sports Zone. I also do some PA announcing work for the university in various sports. I want to take this time and say thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services, 5 days a week, your team every day. The 48-21 victory for the Louisville football team over 10th ranked Wake Forest Demon Deacons was huge, especially for Scott Satterfield's head coaching job security. We're going to talk about the help that it gave Scott Satterfield. Also, we'll talk about why the job is still not done. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. So the victory is great, but you can't let that result trickle into your performances moving forward. And then finally, we'll dive into the weekly mailbag. So, excuse me. Moving right on along, talking about Scott Satterfield's job security. Let me make this point clear before we start. I am in no position, or do I have any authority, nor do I have any influence on whether or not Scott Satterfield is retained or let go at the end of the season. That decision is made by Athletic Director Josh Hurd and the athletic department. There is no set basis of parameters which would maybe dictate how safe or unsafe Scott Satterfield's job is. Is it a win number? Is it recruiting? Is it a mixture of both? Is it the eye test based upon how the team's looking? Is it fan support? It's probably a mixture of everything. So I don't think that there is a measurable parameter out there that you can say, okay, if this happens, he's for sure the head coach next year, or vice versa, unless he wins out or loses out. I'm just saying that there are many lists that has Scott Satterfield listed firmly on the hot seat, and I'm talking like top 5 candidates on the hot seat throughout college football. Obviously, after that 3-3 start to the season, it seemed like a lot of people were off the Satterfield train. It was a matter of when and not if a change would be made at the end of the season. Unless Louisville turned it around, we would probably be talking about a new head coach next year. Well, I'm here to tell you that things have been turned around. The Cardinals have won the first 2 games after the bye against Pittsburgh and the 10th ranked Wake Forest Demon Deacons. This win against Wake Forest does wonders for the job security of Scott Satterfield. And what it does, it could be something that you look back on in December and you point to this game as maybe one of the main reasons as to why Satterfield would keep his job. It is that big of a win. Anytime you beat a top 10 team, that is an extremely big piece of momentum. It's a big statement. It's a big statement moving forward to where, if you go out and you win, maybe 1 out of the next 4. If you go 6-6 or you go 7-5, but you look back and think, okay, we didn't start the season out all that well. That's on me, sure. But you look at how we ended. We beat Pittsburgh, which was a toss-up game. We beat Wake Forest, who was the number 10 ranked team in the country. And then, let's say you beat one of James Madison or maybe even NC State, and we made it to a bowl game. Granted, maybe we didn't necessarily live up to the expectations that were previously placed on the team coming into the season, but with the recruiting class in place that we have, we believe that there's momentum moving into year 5, and that could very well save his job. And in fact, each and every game is very important here. The last part of this season, the last half of the season, look, every game was going to be critical for Scott Satterfield because, frankly put, I don't think it's far-fetched to say that he's coaching for his job each and every game. The matchup against Pittsburgh was one of those where it was a good win. But I don't think you look at that and think, okay, the job security is completely revamped. Now, granted, I don't necessarily think that is the case with the Wake Forest game either, but beating a top 10 team on national television in dominating fashion, you won 48-21. Look, that is a statement victory. That is a victory that you're going to look back on this season. And unless Louisville loses all 4 games to end the season and they go 5-7, I mean, I think we're at the point now from a couple weeks ago, we were thinking, okay, there's likely going to be a change made. There's not confirmation, but it seems like the writing is on the wall. Now you're like, okay, if Scott Satterfield wins 6 games, is he really is Louisville really going to think about firing him? I'm not sure. I think that that's a conversation to be had if you go 6-6. I honestly think it would depend on what happens in the bowl game. Possibly, maybe, who knows? Maybe the bowl game doesn't hold that much weight, but definitely the game against Kentucky does. If you lose in blowout fashion to Kentucky and you win 6 games in the regular season, maybe there's a conversation to be had. But if you win 7 games and you don't necessarily look all that great against Kentucky, I think if you win 7 games, then you're back next season regardless. But if you win 6, maybe there's a conversation to be had. But put it this way, if your 6 wins included wins over Pittsburgh, James Madison, and NC State, that is what it is. NC State didn't have their starting quarterback. I think you add in the Wake Forest victory, and that really does change, the outlook of the season. Last week, I said that a win against Wake Forest could change everything. Now, granted, there still is work that needs to be done. Like Scott Satterfield can't afford to lose out for the rest of the year because the momentum that you gain in this game against Wake Forest, that goes out the window, right? Because, I mean, you dropped the last 4 games of the season. Granted, 2 of those are against Clemson and Kentucky, both of them being on the road. But there's a huge opportunity here. I just think that for Scott Satterfield, maybe 1 game isn't the end-all be-all, at least not at this point. But with each win, you're getting closer and closer to getting off of that hot seat. Look, there's going to be fans regardless at the end of the season. Louisville could go 9-3. They could win out. And there would be fans that, would look you in the eye and tell you, look, I don't think Scott Satterfield's the guy for the job. I just don't. There's going to be those fans. There's going to be those fans that Louisville will not be able to. Let me put it this way. There's going to be those fans that no matter what Scott Satterfield does, they're not sold. That's just kind of the nature of being a fan and things like that. There's always going to be that sector of a fan base, right? So, but in terms of this game alone, I think it's huge. I don't think that you can understate or, you can't overlook or understate how big of an impact that this has on Scott Satterfield being here next year. Because when you factor in how it seemed like it was just a matter of time after the bye week to now you're on a 3-game winning streak, you're 5-3, you're 1 game away from bowl eligibility that you could very possibly secure it next weekend against James Madison. Now you're like, okay, hold up. All of a sudden, things are changing. Is it perfect? No. I think that there's still some issues that people are having defensively, maybe with the secondary or offensive play calling or things of that nature, but it's evident that something is changing. For those that have disrespected Scott Satterfield, that have criticized him, maybe it's been justified. Maybe the criticism, and then make no mistake about it, some of the criticism that's geared towards Scott Satterfield is very valid and it's justified and it's appropriate because you're in year 4 with a very veteran-led team. You should be beating Florida State with the way the game went. You should definitely be beating Boston College. But if you're going to criticize him, you can also look at how this team has played against Wake Forest and Pittsburgh. Granted, that's only 2 games, and even offensively in both of those games, they didn't look the greatest, so there's still some room that needs to be improved on. But defensively, the team has looked very, very solid, right? So I think that, your applause should be as loud as the criticism was, because I think that if we're going to criticize him the way that we are, we also should applaud him for making some of these changes and what we're seeing. And, it could be an instance to where, this team could have given up and Satterfield could have just threw in the towel and be like, you know what? Oh, well, they're going to owe me my buyout money and I'll be on my way. No, he's fighting right here. He's continually showing that he's invested in recruiting and he's, these guys love Sat. It's very evident that his players love him. and it's going to be a matter of continuing to play that way down the stretch. And this team has, looked adversity in the face, and it's saying, okay, let's go. And the team has looked solid since then. But granted, you could also say that, well, this should have been the case from the beginning. We shouldn't have to say in year 4 that these changes drastically should be made because we've been dealing with the same issues over and over and over. I'm not saying Scott Satterfield's perfect. He still has flaws as a coach that I think need to be worked on. And if he were to come back for year 5, some changes would need to be made, whether that's to the coaching staff, whether that's to philosophy, both, so on and so forth. I'm just saying, overall in general, that yes, he deserved a lot of that criticism in the first half of the season, but now he deserves some applause for what he's doing. And I think that, a lot of that's defensively. We're starting to see some changes offensively as well. So, but to answer the original question, I think the Wake Forest victory was huge in terms of improving job security for Scott Satterfield, but there is still a significant amount of work that still needs to be done. And we're going to talk about that here in just a second as to why the team can't be complacent after a victory against Wake Forest here in just a second, after we talk about our friends over at BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for betting football and the start of the new basketball season. Find all of the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts, and in-depth analysis on every game. And as always, BetOnline remains your continued source for all of your sports wagering information with live in-game betting and up-to-the-minute scores for every sport out there. The fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your favorite games and events, including MLB, MMA, boxing, and golf. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. Thanks again for making Locked On Louisville your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On Sports Today. From the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sports, go beyond the scoreboard and behind the scenes with local experts and insights only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today, available on this app, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts. So moving right on along, like I mentioned, it is a long season, and it's 12 games. To win 6 games, you have to win 6 games. To win 7 games, you have to win 7 games, but you also have to lose 6 games and 5 games, respectively. So the season is not done. The job is not finished for the Louisville football team. As solid as the victory is for the Cardinals over a top 10 team, their first top 10 victory since 2016 when Florida State came to town for College Game Day and Lamar Jackson ran them back to Tallahassee. Look, it's still, we're still in a situation to where the first half of the season means that there still is work to be done. It's different if you were to start out maybe 4-2, 5-1, but you didn't. You started out 3-3. You lost 2 games you shouldn't have against Florida State and Virginia. Granted, you've handled business. All you can do is handle business that's in front of you, right? You handled Pittsburgh. You took care of Wake Forest. You still have 4 games left to go, and you're only at 5-3. So as solid as that victory is, and as seemingly different as the situation that we're in now, let me make one thing perfectly clear. The season's not all the way turned around yet. It's like you've turned it around. You've turned the car around, but now you've got to start going in the other direction. You've got it to where you stopped going down the road, you've turned it around, but you've got to start going in the opposite direction now. You have to start, going in the positive direction, and you've turned it around. I think that yes, the Boston College loss will sting, but I think beating Pittsburgh and Wake Forest, I'm not saying makes up for it, but it kind of masks over that hurt a little bit because, maybe you beat a team or two that you weren't expecting to win against. I know at the beginning of the season, I projected the Wake Forest game to be a loss. I think the Pittsburgh game was going to be a toss-up that I had projected to be a loss, and Louisville comes out on top in both of those. Granted, now you're at 5-3. The job's not done because you could lose the next 4 games, and it's all a moot point because nobody's going to look back if you lose these next 4 games. Nobody's going to look back and think, well, still beat Pittsburgh and Wake. That kind of loses its luster, right? You lose some of that momentum you had. So it's going to be a matter of doing what you can these next 2 games. The next 2 games will really, really dictate the direction of this program moving forward. Because, James Madison is a very winnable game. The Cardinals are favored by, I think, 7 currently. NC State is without Devin Leary. They barely beat Virginia Tech last Thursday. I think they won by 1 point. So very clearly, the Wolfpack are struggling with no Devin Leary, which that makes a lot of sense. So, and they will have to play at Cardinal Stadium. So Louisville has 2 more home games left in the season, and they have a chance to get to 7 wins. If you get to 7 wins, you lose the games against Clemson and Kentucky, and it's like, okay, well, it is what it is, right? And you see what you can do in the bowl game. But granted, right now, hey, look, you're in a situation to where you still have some work that needs to be done. And I think that you getting complacent would be counterproductive. It would definitely start to revert some of that progress. And I'm not saying that that's how the team is going to end up. I'm not saying that they're not going to be able to look past this week, but each and every week, good teams relish in the victory in the current sense, and then they turn the page because you have to. Now, you can definitely use that confidence and use that momentum, but you still have to, keep a solid focus moving forward because, James Madison, NC State still are pretty solid teams. So overall, the job is not finished, and it is what it is. But it's a good start. I said that there probably wasn't one game that Louisville would win in the second half of the schedule that I would look at and think, wow, the whole season is a success now. It's a collaborative effort, right? It's a collective sense to where Louisville has to at least split, and they're 2-0. It's a good start, and you've beaten Wake Forest, who's probably a top 3 toughest team in your schedule. And you could argue that Pittsburgh is just as good as NC State right now. So maybe, optimistically speaking, you've beaten 2 of the top 4 teams that you'll play. Granted, Clemson and Kentucky are probably a little bit higher in terms of how good they are. I do think Kentucky is better than what a lot of Louisville fans are making them out to be. But Clemson is very, very solid as well. They have shown that they could be beat, but it's going to be very tough to win down in Death Valley, something that they literally have not done since joining the ACC is beat Clemson. So it is what it is. Scott Satterfield's job security has improved, but there's still work that needs to be done. Louisville has made some significant strides. They've gotten that statement victory that we've been looking for the past couple seasons, but at the end of the day, same concept applies, right? We are still in a situation to where more work needs to be done. So I feel comfortable in saying that I feel good about where the team sits ahead of this week's matchup against James Madison. However, that's extremely positive moving forward because James Madison has lost their past couple games. Excuse me. So the matchup doesn't maybe look as daunting as it did when they cracked the top 25 rankings. So who knows? With the victory over James Madison, Louisville right now is currently sitting in the other receiving votes in the AP top 25. So who knows? From 2 weeks ago to now, there's been a lot of change and a lot of strides that have been made. Still a lot of ways to go. So we'll continue to talk about football as the week goes on. But for the remainder of the show, we'll dive into the weekly mailbag. Before we do that, I want to say thank you all again for making Locked On the Louisville your first listen of the day. Just a reminder, the Locked On the Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services, including YouTube and WHAS 11+. You can go to WHAS11.com, scroll down to the sports section, check out the show, watch the show with all the episodes that are posted 5 days a week, your team every day. Diving into the weekly mailbag, a lot of good questions, a lot of questions that here's a lot of the fan base is asking. The first one, the main one, what are your overall thoughts on the Louisville's loss in the exhibition against a Division II school? Okay, this is the topic that dominated Sunday conversation on social media. Louisville lost by, I think, 10 points to a Division II school in the first exhibition game under Kenny Payne. There's 2 schools of thought. There's part of the fan base that are basically saying, well, it doesn't matter. It's an exhibition game. You got to give Kenny Payne some time to, to get these guys developed and get his guys into the program. And then there's another side of the fan base that says, well, it's a Division II team. I don't care how bad you are. You shouldn't lose to that team. I'm kind of sitting in both camps here because let me put it this way. Louisville is a program to where you can't look at a Division II loss and think, well, you can expect it to happen. Nobody expected Louisville to lose to a Division II school. If you would have asked someone at 1 o'clock, do you think Louisville beats this team today? Probably 100% of the people would be like, yeah, maybe it's not too awful pretty, but they're going to win. It was a very, very unconvincing loss. And it's something that you look at, and I'm sorry, I will never get to a point where I'm a fan of the University of Louisville and I'm going to accept a loss to a Division II school. I'm not going to try to justify it either. What I will do, however, is I will acknowledge that this game doesn't mean anything, that it is the first game under Kenny Payne, that Kenny has a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work that needs to be done with the roster moving forward. Guys will need to be developed. This was a team that won 14 games last year, so they struggled. I do think Kenny Payne is the right guy for the job. So I'm not overreacting. I think two things can be true at one time. I think you can look at a Division II loss and think there's no way that Louisville should lose to a Division II school. Unacceptable. I agree with that point, but I also agree with the fact that Kenny Payne needs some time. Just because they lost yesterday does not mean that Kenny Payne's not the guy for he's not the guy for the job. I'm saying that he needs a year or two to get his guys into the system, to implement his system, and get to a point to where you're winning consistently. I think that will come. But right now, you look at that loss and it's one that kind of stings. You look at it and it gives you a sour taste because it's like, okay, losing to a D2 school though, how tough of a season is it going to be? I think that this loss kind of reiterated that this year could be tough. I think the expectation still should be making the NCAA tournament because that's always going to be my expectation for the Louisville program. But the loss kind of makes you wonder just how tough it's going to be. You question about guard play moving forward. That was something that Louisville didn't add a guard, in the transfer portal. They went the high school route with Devin Reed, Kamari Lands, and Fabio Basili, but didn't add any in the transfer portal. And we'll see if that's going to be able to hurt them moving forward. Mike James is going to take some time for him to get to where he's 100% following that Achilles injury and like truly in form in terms of playing. So to answer the question, doesn't feel good losing to a Division II school. I'm never going to sit there and be like, oh, well, we're not that good. I don't care. It's a D2 school. But I will say that I think that this team is better than that. I think that, this game doesn't matter, obviously. So hopefully this serves as a wake-up call because I have faith in Kenny Payne. I have faith in these players. I think that there's some solid talent on the roster. It's just a matter of now putting it together, implementing your system, and continuing to improve. So I'm not writing Kenny Payne off, but I do think that the notion that fans can't be critical of this loss is kind of silly as well, because you definitely can't be. But like I said, Kenny Payne, in my opinion, is still the guy for the job. It's just going to take some time, which we all expected, coming into this because of how bad things ended in the Chris Mack era. So moving right on along into the football side of things, the recruiting side, how big of a victory over Wake Forest? How big does this victory over Wake Forest have of an impact on Ruben Bain's recruitment? I don't necessarily know how much. I mean, it definitely can't hurt it, seeing what they just did defensively. I mean, you can definitely go to Ruben Bain and say, hey, look what we just did. You could be a part of that defense next year. And Ruben Bain did tweet out after the game, so that was big time. So I think it definitely didn't hurt. Like I said, I think that this is a game that could probably do a lot of wonders for prospective recruits and prospects in this year's class, but also current commits, because that there's probably many schools out there that are saying, look, Scott Satterfield's on the hot seat. Why are you staying committed to a program that the head coach is on the hot seat? Well, now Louisville's 5-3, and Scott Satterfield can answer back as like, well, we're heading in the right direction. So I think that that's kind of the main thing right there. The third question, you hyped up Travion Cooley earlier this week. Tyon Evans came back, ran for over 100 yards. How would you hand out the workload for the upcoming matchup against James Madison? It's always hard to do because it's a very balanced approach, because Jawar Jordan is playing well as well. Jalen Mitchell is healthy. I would probably say that I would give Tyon Evans probably 10 to 15 carries. I'd give Travion Cooley maybe 8 to 10 carries as well, because I think that they're probably your top two best running backs. But it's all about going with the hot hand. A couple weeks ago, it was Travion Cooley. They went back to Tyon Evans, and Tyon Evans ran for over 100 yards and had a big touchdown run. So I think Tyon Evans is probably your best running back on the roster, but still, it's one of those instances where you probably could go with a handful of different guys. So keeping going. Why do you think that Wake Forest picked on Cottrell Clark as much as they did on Saturday? It seemed like they were throwing his direction a lot, which is a lot different from how ACC offenses treated him last year. That's a good question. I guess it's maybe a matchup standpoint. Wake Forest does have big receivers. Maybe they felt like they had a height advantage with Cottrell Clark, maybe not being the biggest defensive back, but there's also smaller defensive backs all over the field for Louisville. So maybe they felt like it was just a solid matchup. They went with maybe it was a designed, couple designed routes. Maybe it was just something as what Sam Hartman was seeing, when plays developed. Granted, Hartman didn't have a ton of time to make decisions, so I won't look too much into it. Maybe they made it an effort to go after Cottrell Clark. Maybe they didn't. Maybe it was just something that Sam Hartman was seeing. But overall, I think Cottrell Clark held his own, showed why he's one of the best cornerbacks in the ACC. So I would be surprised if a lot of teams targeted him like Wake Forest did this past week moving forward. So that's going to wrap up all of the mailbag questions for this episode of the show. I want to say thanks again for making us your first listen of the day. Be sure to check out Locked On Sports Today, also on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. But that's going to wrap up this Halloween edition of the show. Thanks again for tuning in to the show this month. But I'm probably going to take a day or two off in early November for the next couple of days, probably at least tomorrow. But we'll likely be back on Wednesday. So just a heads up for scheduling purposes. But that's going to wrap up this Monday edition of the show. Everyone have a great day. We'll see you right back here very soon.